Welcome to Collision, the podcast where we discuss the fun and sometimes complicated collision of real life and trusting God. If you're curious or confused about how to engage the world we live in, we hope our conversation here helps. Now, let's get into this episode of Collision.
Well, hello and welcome to the Collision Podcast. My name is James and I'm here with my buddy Pastor Matt. We're pastors here at Crossroads Church in Thornton, Colorado. And the Collision Podcast exists so that we as pastors can talk about that place of collision with faith and real life. And for us, it gives us a place to kind of go unfiltered and talk about the messiness of that. And the reality is where you live and let's face it, where we live as well. So on that, our opening question has nothing to do with where we're going today, Matt. But we're in this political season, and it's kind of a something show going on out there.
It is indeed.
And my dream is if we could actually go across the country, and like the military can draft soldiers. Like, what if we could draft someone to be our president for the next 8 years? Like, they have no choice. We show up with handcuffs, and we basically say, "You've done a really good job in your field. We're making you run the country for 8 years." Whose house would you knock on, Matt?
I feel like after a year of making fun of you and dragging you into ridiculous questions, that this one is deserved. So I think if I was looking outside of politics, I would go with the sheriff, Peyton Manning.
Ooh, wow.
Right? I mean, he can run a team. He's proven to run a media organization. He's funny. Right? Like, I don't know anything about his politics. I don't know where he stands on issues. But if you got to put me, if you're asking me right now, who would you go for? I think it's Peyton Manning.
That's legit. You heard it here. Pastor Matt, Peyton Manning for president, 2024.
Yes, the Bronco version, not the Tennessee Volunteer version. I just want that to be
the evolved Peyton Manning.
That's right.
I love it. I love it. So our subject for today, we're in a preaching series right now called "We Are Family," where we're basically looking at this idea, the biblical idea that we cultivate spiritual health. As a family unit, not just as individuals. And it's also like core to our values as Crossroads. So we're going to talk about your sermon from last week, but we're going to start with the vision statement for Crossroads is that we're a multi-ethnic, multi-generational church making disciples of the next generation, our kids and our grandkids. Yes. So if we can unpack two pieces of that as it pertains to this, Matt, the first one is, what does it mean to be a multi-generational church?
Yeah, I think really simply is that we don't all look alike. I think that's kind of the ethos of both the multi-generational and multi-ethnic part of our vision statement. That at Crossroads, we take great pride in that on any given Sunday, there are families here that are 3 generations deep. One family, at times, when great-grandma can make it, 4 generations deep here at Crossroads Church worshiping together. Like, that is such a beautiful picture, I think, of heaven. But that really is kind of bigger than just like a Sunday morning. We want Sunday morning to have multi-generations, but really, like, even how does it filter down? And so a really easy example of that is in my own community group. I've shared this before. The oldest person in my community group is in their 60s. The youngest person in my community group is in their 30s. There's a 30-year span. Most all of us are in a different season of life. The oldest couple, their kids are grown and they're moving into that empty nest stage. There's 2 couples that of us that have kids right there in high school, and we're kind of learning, like, as those teenagers start to spread their wings and take flight, what does that look like as a family? And then we have a couple who is with a young child. And so we're in different stages of life. We're different ages. Very much my community group is a multi-generational community group. And I think there's a lot of value in learning cross-generationally from people.
Yeah, that's so good. And where that resonates with me is like like in our family, music's always been a big deal for me.
Yeah.
And the house that I grew up in, my dad listened to Simon and Garfunkel,
Yeah.
Bridge Over Troubled Water, and that was like all you heard in our house. And in our household, like I raised my kids on like Johnny Cash and the Beatles and like the good worship music.
Yeah.
But
I
as
forgot your favorite band.
oh, and U2 and Pearl Jam.
Okay, there it is.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I had to wait for Pearl Jam because there's some content there. But as they've gotten older, it's been fun to go to Starbucks with my daughter and just have like the conversation is, what are you listening to? And she introduced me to bands, and my son introduces me to bands, and so our family playlist is everything from The Cure and Depeche Mode and bands that I introduced them to, and bands that they introduced my wife and I to, and just kind of that ability for us to influence each other in a healthy way as parents to our kids and our kids to us as parents.
Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine when Emma said, "Dad, you got to listen to this Katy Perry song."
Yeah, exactly. So the other question is, in our mission statement, it says to make disciples of the next generation, our kids and our grandkids. And I know from conversation, a lot of people think that means that we want to have just a killer kids and student ministries, which isn't not true.
Yeah.
But it doesn't exactly mean that. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, inherent in that statement is a concern for the rising generation, which is what this whole sermon series is about, right? Like, what does it look like to disciple those who are 0 to 18 years old? But the way that we stated the vision is actually bigger than that, because the reality is that every single one of us is a kid or a grandkid, right? And the way that we phrase this intentionally is that with kind of the vantage point that every generation is responsible for the next generation behind them, right? And so, as a 44-year-old guy, I'm responsible for that, and as a millennial, right, that I am responsible for Gen Z. Like, that is the upcoming next generation that I should be investing in. And I should also be investing in Gen Alpha, which is my kids' generation, right? You, as a Gen Xer, right, should be looking towards the millennials and going, man, how do I speak life into them? How do I connect with the Gen Z? What do I have to say, to someone who is of the Alpha generation? And so the way that we put this in place and the way that we state it in terms of vision is really in a way that, because all of us are kids and grandkids, most likely all of us will have kids and grandkids. Statistically, that's still true today in America, even though the birth rate's going down. It's really an eye on going, what am I doing in terms of highlighting, showing, speaking, living out, always in such a way that the next generation sees the faithfulness of God, gives their heart to them, and then walks with them as a disciple, as a follower, as an apprentice. Choose your word there. But basically gives their whole life to God and goes, this is the way I want to live.
Yeah.
And that lives with each one of us.
Yeah, that's so good. I mean, it reminds me when our daughter Emma was born, and I held this little person, and I had this thought, and it sounds morbid, but it was actually beautiful. Like I looked at her and I thought, if this goes the way it should, this person is going to be standing over my grave.
Yeah.
And
that's interesting. That is your first thought, holding your daughter.
Yeah, of dying. Yeah, right. That's what a lot of people have said over the.
You had a long view, man. You were playing the long game.
It's not look at her cute little button nose. It was like,
man, this isn't checkers here. This is chess.
Yeah. And it gave my life a different purpose in that moment of what my life looks like moving forward. Gears toward this person launching well. Yeah. And okay, so on that, the next question for us to throw out there, like as pastors, I mean, everybody wants to live a great legacy. And I think for a lot of men, especially as they get older, they start looking around and all of us screw up. All of us make financial mistakes. All of us make relational mistakes,
parenting mistakes
every
day.
Yeah. and I think the hardest thing, especially in our men's ministry, when we hear men pretty consistently later in life share about that this is an area of life that they have regrets. So kind of zooming out of that for you and I, like as you've had those conversations like I have, what's resonated with you as far as life lessons from men that we've walked with that has just kind of set your trajectory maybe as doing this well?
Yeah. So I think that whenever we start talking about like failures as men, and particularly the one that comes with the most regret is failure as fathers, there's just such deep regret that happens there, and we see the consequence of that, in sons and daughters. I think a couple of things that I've learned through the years, or maybe just two, is, I'll start off with saying parenting is really hard, right? And when you start to talk about parenting, people think that you're the expert, and we're not, right? We're like two guys trying to figure it out. We've made all of the mistakes that you can make, even as pastors, and so we don't come at this as experts, but rather as people who have experienced and in some ways have some of the same regrets that older men have taught us. But the two things that I would say that I've learned from mentors in my life is, one, the first thing is that in our failures, we actually have the opportunity to admit our weakness and point to something that's better, right? God. And I think too often men in their pride, when we fail, we try to cover it up. We try to present like it doesn't exist. We try to just move on and make amends instead of actually demonstrating what does a repentant heart look like, and how do I show my kids in my repentance to that this is what it looks like when we come to our Father, God our Father.
Yeah.
And I think so oftentimes we miss that, and we try to cover up our failures, and then years later we miss out, and all we can remember is our failures, and not how God used those failures as some of the greatest points of redemption in our life. And so I would say like that's one of the things that I would learn. And then I think the second is really as dads in particular, as men, the way that I read Scripture, and particularly in Deuteronomy chapter 6, before the Shema is spoken, which is where I spent a majority of this message, Moses really leans into guys, and he says, you're to know this, not just for your sake, but for your son's sake and for your son's son's sake, right? And there's this thing that moves throughout the entirety of the Scriptures that we miss in modern America. In modern America, we think of our family as me, my wife Sarah, my son Theo, Cademan, and my daughter Mercy. That's my family. And what the Bible continually pushes on us is saying, men, dads, you should have a bigger vision of family than that. That your family goes beyond what you can see today, right? Your family, the vision for your family needs to extend generations to kids and grandkids that you may never see in your lifetime. Do you have a vision that's big enough to carry the faithfulness of God to that generation?
Yeah.
And I think when we start thinking the way that you did, I poked fun.
Yeah.
But as you're holding Emma and you have that long-term vision, that is amazing and further than most people think. But what does it look like to go, man, if this is done right, my great-grandkids are going to actually speak about Grandpa James.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
With the kind of awe and the faithfulness that, that goes, that guy didn't have it all right.
Yeah.
But that guy was about Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so powerful, and I think we've all had that experience, like with old family photos, where your mom says, "Oh, that's so and so. He was your grandfather's brother," and it's just a face.
Yeah.
Like there's no story there, and it's a little humbling to realize, in a generation, a lot of people just disappear.
Yeah. Yeah, statistically, most people cannot name the first names of their great-grandparents.
Yeah. But some people, the legacy of their passion or their joy, or it's like, man, this person changed the narrative of our family.
Yes.
And we were going down this road, and they invited God into our story. And
Absolutely. And it changed everything.
Changed everything. That's so cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so the passage this week was from the Shema, which is in Deuteronomy 6, and it's an amazing passage for Jewish people.
Yeah.
It was obviously huge. I mean, it was a commanded thing. And I'm going to read. Or do you have anything to say about it before I dive into it?
No, you just nailed it, right? I think in the Jewish culture, there is nothing bigger than the Shema of Deuteronomy chapter 6. This is the verse of the Old Testament.
And it's interesting because it has two verses of the what, and then the rest of it is the how.
Yep.
And a lot of times we read the first part and we're like, yeah, that sounds good. But then most of it's about how do you do this? So I'll read it and then we'll just kind of unpack it and get some of your insight. So it says this, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Jesus used those same exact words in his ministry. And then he says this, and these words that I command to you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk to them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as a frontlet between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So most of this is actually about the how of doing that. And if we can just unpack like what he's describing there and what that looks like when it takes on flesh. In our lives.
Yeah. I think like understanding the Shema, to like just go back a little bit, is to realize that like Deuteronomy is the second law. That's what the name actually means, the second law, right? The first law was given when, Moses through God has this amazing miraculous moment where they rescue the Hebrew people out of Egypt and slavery of 400 years. They kind of wander in the desert for a couple of months, parting of the Red Sea, all this kind of stuff happens, right? And they end up at Mount Sinai, and that's where the first law is given. Exodus, the Ten Commandments, Leviticus, all of that kind of stuff, right? So that's the first law. And what's really fascinating in the story is that all that were rescued out of Egypt, that entire generation of people, that God looked upon them and said, this is a rebellious generation. This isn't the generation that's going to inherit the promised land. And so they wander in the desert for 40 years. And Deuteronomy is written because all of their children, all of these slave kids, are about to enter into the promised land. And Moses is writing them. This is really like a sermon where he's like reminding them of their history at the beginning of Deuteronomy. He reminds them of the Ten Commandments again. And then he makes it to the greatest commandment, which is the Shema here. And he's doing all of this reminding to them. And it's kind of fascinating to me because it's like of all the people who's ever lived in the history of the world, I don't think those are the guys that needed to be reminded. They saw this in real life. Mom and dad didn't get to come in. And yet there's just this reminder that God's people always need to be reminded of what the important things are. And so there's this command to love, and that we are to live our entire lives as this wholly devoted love to the God who is so amazing, who is so faithful. And then he says, and in your life, teach your children, do this diligently. And that word teach there, there's a lot of different ways to teach, right? Very specifically, this word teach is like didactic, right? But you can lecture, you can model, you can observe, right? These are all different ways that we teach. And the reality is the call here is to use all of those means and methods to help our children, right, know the laws of God, to know what it looks like to walk as his people. And so for like a quick example, right, there are moments where we sit our kids down and we go, this is what God's word says, family devotional time. That's a way to teach, right? There's also like in our own rules. One of the rules in the Manning house is lying is a big deal. Like lying's not acceptable. And if my kids came to me and said, Dad, why do we not lie? And I said, because lying's bad, they go, oh, okay. But then later on in life, there's these moments where they go, maybe lying's not so bad, right? Like if my wife comes to me and says, hey, how do these pants make me look?
Yeah.
Right? All of a sudden, lying's bad.
Yeah.
Saying what I'm about to say, also bad.
But you're not eating that night anyway you look at it.
That's right. And so there's these moments like where we put, instead of going, look, like God actually calls us to be people of integrity. Like our yes and no is important. And the reason that it's important is because when we start to talk about the things of God and what God has done in our lives, we don't want to bring any question of our integrity in those moments.
Yeah.
And so this is why lying's important, or not lying, being honest is important, is because eventually you're going to be called upon to share the things of God. And when you do, you want the people that you're speaking to know that you're speaking honestly and truthfully.
Yeah,
that's
so
the ways
good.
in lying, right? And so these are the ways that we teach our kids to make sure we understand this. And so later on in the passage in verse 20, we get to the point where it goes, one day your son's going to come to you and go, why do we have all these rules and statutes? Like, why are all these things existing? And overwhelmingly, it's pointing to remind them of their faithfulness. Remind your children of God's faithfulness. The greatest thing that you can teach your kids is that God is faithful. And so practically, what's that look like in my own life? Just kind of a fun example. In the beginning of July, we had a big conference where all these missionaries were here, and we planned a worship night. And we're here in Colorado. We sit on land that has a beautiful view of the Front Range of the mountains, and so we planned this worship night. And on Wednesday night, the night before, I just prayed publicly with our leadership team that God would bring one of those glorious sunsets that we get to participate in, right? Like, just make it beautiful. And that night, we're sitting there singing, and the sunset is going down, and you were there, and it was one of the gorgeous sunsets that we have here in Colorado.
On cue during How Great Thou Art.
Yes, at that point,
it was like,
the light breaks forth, right, and it is a blinding, beautiful, majestic, I don't think it's too light of a word to use, sunset.
It reminded me of the Truman Show where like someone was like, and 3, 2, 1, go. And it was like the perfect thing, like at the chorus. It was like, this is ridiculous.
Right? And I look at that and I go, God didn't have to do that, right? God could have brought us rain that night.
Yeah.
God could have, it could have been cloud covered, right? It could have been just a regular sunset, which, we still have more beautiful sunsets than most everybody in the country. But it could have been any of those things. And yet God chose, for whatever reason, to answer that prayer that I prayed on Wednesday night.
It's so good.
And so that night when I got home, with the kids, I just shared them the story of the prayer that I prayed on Wednesday, and how, for whatever reason, God chose to listen and to answer that prayer in such a vivid and vibrant way. And it was just a 2-minute conversation with my kids of what God had done. And it was like, I'm teaching my kids in that moment, in their lying down, right?
Yeah.
In their lying down, when they were going to bed, teach them, and just a subtle reminder, not even subtle, an obvious reminder of God's faithfulness in our lives, that God hears our prayers. How long that'll carry them, right?
Yeah.
In the future, when they're on their knees praying because of something that's happening in their lives, like, I want them to remember, like, there was that moment that my dad prayed and God delivered on a sunset.
Yeah.
Something so minor.
Yes.
And yet God heard. And so that's the way that I put the practical, flesh around those bones.
Yeah, that's so good. And for our family, I didn't want my kids to grow up thinking that God lived in a box.
Yeah.
That we go to the church and we sing and we learn, but I always wanted him to be bigger than that, because he is.
Yeah.
And that for us, when our kids were little, and the Christian school in Seattle, like they contacted me like, hey, Pastor, we know our school's expensive, but we'd really love to have your family here. And my wife and I were like, we're gonna send them to public school. Yeah. So they got exposed to all the Seattle weirdness early on. But what we would do, my wife always made sure that they got good grades.
Yeah.
But for me, it was always, what did you learn today? And what do you believe? Is that truth or is that error?
Yeah.
So they were introduced to things all the time, and we would have conversations over dinner about what they learned in their class. And it was like, do you believe that's true? Well, how does that relate to what the Bible tells us about this? And we developed critical thinking in a culture that was, by and large, trying to kind of brainwash our kids.
Right.
So the education of that was us kind of letting the school system and the culture that they have to live in it.
Yep.
They have to learn how to live there. But we wanted to help them cultivate the right commentary and see God in the midst of that. So that happened at school. Yep. It happened on the baseball diamond every spring, right? Yeah. And the excitement of it happened in the music that we listened to. Yeah. And seeing all of that as fodder for them to hear. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it doesn't have to look weird, right? Sarah and I have made a similar decision of putting our kids in public schools and going, like, part of our parenting is going to help them. How do they navigate? How do they have Christian witness when the vast majority of people around them are not? What does that look like? And there's a scariness to that. Like, and there's a risk. Like, this could go terribly wrong.
Totally.
And yet this is like where we've chosen to kind of live. And so, like one of the great parenting proud moments of my life is my middle son, Cademan, just has deep compassion for people, particularly for the vulnerable. And he won this, award, and the teacher who wrote it spoke to just the way that he cared for this boy who had special needs in the classroom. And like there wasn't like a dry eye in the entire auditorium when it was a beautiful written thing. And yet, and when we came home, I just told Cademan, I said, the thing that teacher saw in you was Jesus. Mm-hmm. When Jesus says that we're to speak out for the vulnerable, that we're to see those that other people don't see. You demonstrated that, and your teacher noticed.
Yeah.
Your teacher noticed, and that's big. And so it's even in those, like, when your kid does something well, of trying to pull it back into a place that goes, this is where God's been faithful. You're living this out. Good job, buddy.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And then on the other side of that equation, like there was one time a couple of years ago at the high school here where my son in the springtime, he got kicked out of his Spanish class for mouthing off.
Yeah.
And so he told us about it, and so I sit down with him and said, okay, well, let's get her email and write an email to her and ask for a conversation so you can apologize. And he was like, I'm not going to do that. And I was like, okay, that's fine. So let's write another email to your baseball coach and tell him that you're not going to be at practice because you're refusing to go to your Spanish teacher and own your crap.
Yep.
And I'm not saying it was all you,
Yeah.
but you had something to do with it. And so you make the call.
Yeah.
You're writing an email, and I'm reading it before it goes out.
That's right.
Right?
You can enrich whatever one you want to write.
Yeah, it's a choose your own adventure, man. Like,
Absolutely.
But the ability for us to shape that, and and when they're younger, we control a little bit more. But in the teenage years, it's like I'd recommend one road.
Yeah.
It's going to hurt less.
Yeah.
But you're growing into a man, but these values, like you said, with lying and with integrity, it's like that's who we are. Mm-hmm. That's who Johnsons are, and that's what a follower of Jesus looks like. Yeah. So something happened. You need to own your part of it.
Yep.
And then we move forward because that's just what life looks like.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's so good.
So
that's really good.
Well, Matt, so good.
Yeah.
There's great stuff here. Any last words for people?
Yeah, I think, when it comes to, when we talk about the rising generation, I think that there's like a huge opportunity in our world. We're actually watching, I think, the rise of the pagan generation in the United States right now. And for us to go and even double down and focus and go, look, this is what it looks like to actually make disciples of the next generation, and to realize that we as parents, right, are called to be the primary discipleship makers of our kids, right? That this isn't accidental in our lives, that this is actually the calling of our lives. If we have kids, this is what it looks like. And that is not without failure. There is a lot of grace in that. And I think that's just the thing that I would want to remind everybody who's listening who has kids is that parenting is hard. What you do matters. There's going to be plenty of opportunities where you fail and feel like a complete failure in this, and yet God's grace is big enough to cover, and that those failures can one day be the greatest opportunity of your witness because of the way that you respond to them. And so don't let the mishaps and the weakness and the failure points be the place where it goes, well, I'm just going to throw all this away. I got to walk away. I can't do any of this.
Yeah.
But allow those to be just another part of the story that you're telling in the grace of God, and your kids will see it.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. It's scary because God transforms us while He uses us like that, because swallowing our pride and owning what we did, man, that's tough. But God will build that next generation as He humbles us and uses us in that.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, hey, we would love to walk life with you in unpacking topics like this and just the complexity of real life and real faith with God. So we're in Thornton, Colorado, and we gather every Sunday at 8:30, 10 o'clock, and 11:30. We'd love to meet you in person. So if you're in the area, hit us up, and we'd love to meet you there.
All right. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to Collision. This podcast is a production of Crossroads Church in Thornton, Colorado. For more excellent content, please visit crossroadsabc.com.